Hi, and welcome to this video, which provides a short introduction to applying human learning systems to commissioning. My name's Dawn Plimmer, I'm from Collaborate CIC, and I'll be joined by Alex Fox from the Mayday Trust, Gary Wallace from Plymouth City Council, and Amy Hurst, my colleague at Collaborate. Together, we'll share some practical examples and also reflect on what human learning systems means for commissioning. To start with, I'm going to provide a short introduction and context to human learning systems. And I'm going to take complexity as our context. So in human learning systems, we always start by acknowledging the complexity of each of our lives, as the systems of support that exist, and of the social issues that many of us are working to tackle, whether it's mental health, homelessness, community wellbeing. All of these issues are complex. So what do we mean by complex? What do we mean by complexity? So we're talking about complexity when there are many different actors and factors interacting together to create an outcome in someone's life. These factors are interacting continually in unpredictable and ever-changing ways, creating different outcomes for different people at different times. And these factors are beyond the control of any one organisation, any one project, any one individual. And this diagram here reflects just a few of the different actors and factors that can combine in someone's life to create the outcome of well-being or not. There are many different factors, always interacting in different ways at different times. And all of these factors are beyond the control of any single individual or organisation. And this is one of the key takeaways we wanted to emphasise to start with. Outcomes are not delivered by organisations or by projects or by individuals. Outcomes emerge from complex systems. But the typical traditional way that we've managed public services over the past few decades tries to ignore or control complexity. So new public management has been the dominant approach that has influenced public services and in turn the voluntary and community sector. And this is based on the idea of markets. So if we pit organisations in competition with each other, the idea that this creates better outcomes. The idea of managerialism, that if we test whether desired objectives are being met, if we focus on compliance, the idea that that will result in better outcomes. And metrics, the idea that if we measure and monitor ourselves toward targets and KPIs, that will create better outcomes. But actually what we're increasingly recognising and experiencing, whether we're people accessing support, whether we're charities, other providers, whether we're commissioners, this approach doesn't work. Complexity is a reality, and trying to control or ignore that doesn't work. It can contribute to gaming of targets, it can create siloed working, and most importantly, it can create poor outcomes or even unintended harm to people accessing public services. They might get stuck in a cycle of services, get institutionalized, be stigmatized. So human learning systems is all about how can we embrace complexity rather than trying to ignore or manage it. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. What is human learning systems? What does it look like if we embrace and acknowledge complexity as our starting point? So the key things I wanted to emphasize to start with is in human learning systems, we start with the purpose of public service being to enable human flourishing. We're talking about our broader purpose. What is the change we're trying to contribute to in people's lives? Not how do we commission XYZ service, but how do we enable human flourishing? How do we enable everyone to live a good life? That means broadening our lens from how we usually think about the purpose of commissioning. And to enable this, we need to acknowledge and work with, not seek to control complexity. I'm going to really briefly talk through the features of human learning systems now. So firstly, being human, this is all about valuing relationships, focusing on people's strengths and aspirations, valuing what matters to people, rather than treating people as problems to be fixed or deficits to correct. And importantly, the human part of human learning systems is all about devolving decision-making much closer to communities. In complexity, the people who know best are those experiencing the issue and those around them, not a commissioner sitting in an office miles away or national government even further away. So how do we enable much more flexibility and decision-making closer to communities? Secondly, learning. So focusing on learning and adaptation as the strategy for change. It's not a phase in an innovation cycle. It's not someone that an evaluation manager does. Learning is the strategy for change. Success is not sticking to a plan 3 years later, but success is continually learning, adapting to respond to the changing context and what we're learning from our approach. It's about testing, it's about experimenting, it's about acknowledging we don't know all the answers. And thirdly, systems. So recognizing that systems are connected and interdependent, outcomes are created, outcomes emerge from complex systems. And what we're looking for are healthy systems which are more likely to enable the positive outcomes we're looking for. So systems that have shared purpose, where there's collaboration, where there's deep listening to the people that we're here to support. And we often in human learning systems talk about system stewards, and these are people that nurture healthy systems. Healthy systems don't happen by accident. Because of the dominant ways of new public management we've talked about, the default is competition. The default is sticking to targets rather than learning. So that we need to have a really purposeful, intentional focus on nurturing healthy systems if we are to achieve complexity-friendly ways of working. And I've talked a little bit about system stewards, and we see lots of different people in an organisation play a system stewardship role. There might be charities, there might be funders, there might be commissioners, there might be public services. It's whoever's got legitimacy in a system. And system stewardship isn't just about delivery. It can be about delivery, but it's also about a distinct set of practices focused on nurturing a healthy system. So fostering trusting relationships, bringing people together around a common purpose, deeply listening to people, particularly the most unheard voices, enabling learning, and really paying attention to power dynamics. If we're going to shift the system to create better outcomes, we need to shift the dominant power dynamics that exist. So we'll explore this more throughout the session, but what we're saying is we need to reframe commissioning from purchasing of outputs or even outcomes which are beyond the control of any single organisation, whether that's a commissioner or provider, instead to nurturing a healthy system. So to bring to life what a human learning system approach to delivery looks like, we're next going to hear from Alex Fox from the Mayday Trust, and then we'll hear from Gary Wallace from Plymouth City Council, who's going to reflect on, so what does that mean for how we commission? And then we'll finally turn to my colleague, Amy, who's going to kind of reflect on what does this mean for commissioners if we start with complexity and embrace a human learning systems approach.
Thank you. So you may not have come across us. We are not a huge organisation, but we are quite a radical organisation. And I can say that because I wasn't the person that did the radical change. That happened about 10 years ago. And it was our leadership team at the time created space to listen to the people we worked with, who were people who were homeless, and we were providing housing and accommodation services. And they created a person-led listening approach, which we still do today, which we call the Wisdoms. And our first report was called Wisdom from the Streets. And people told us some quite uncomfortable things, which is always when you know you're learning something valuable. They told us that what we were doing wasn't working and actually had become part of the problem for them. So our services were all about people's progression and people moving on, but actually people were getting stuck in those services and not moving on. And they said that's because we'd become so fixated on their problems that we couldn't see their capacity and their potential and their strengths. And that was leading us to try and fix people, which was stopping people from being able to take charge of their own lives. And we were segregating people into specialist services, and sometimes a whole raft of specialist services, each one difficult to get into, but also difficult and risky to leave. Because that wasn't just about the support, it was about the relationships people had as well. And I was working alongside a man called Brooke at a conference last week, who described that process of as services moved him along a pathway that was set by them. At each step that they saw as progress, he just saw as another layer of support being removed and another step closer to the situation which had led his mental health to break down and which had resulted in his homelessness in the first place. So he felt he was just going in a big circle whilst everybody else was applauding the progress. So Mayday did something really unusual in the charity world, which is they didn't just listen, they actually completely changed the organisation's business model, stopped doing a perfectly good support and accommodation business over 10 years and developed an approach we call the PTS response, which I'll say a bit about in a moment. But on the next slide, I think what we were recognising at that point was something that's really deeply ingrained in our public services. And I wrote a book a few years ago called Escaping the Invisible Asylum, where I argued that this goes back to the origins of charities and public services, which have always divided the world into two groups of people. So on the one hand, people that can live as citizens, and we all organise our lives around things that are meaningful to us. We don't tend to think as much of our independence as we might in services. We tend to think about things like actually our dependence on others and our meaningful contribution to others, hope, dreams and love. And then on the other side of the threshold, into when people find themselves drawn deeply into services, that can be a world that feels very different, speaks a very different language of need, risk, control, quality, outcomes. And although we used to more visibly divide people into those two groups, but I've always felt that we still have that thinking very deeply ingrained into our services. So we may not have as many physical gates, but we've got plenty of gatekeepers, plenty of thresholds to cross.
So I see care is a doing word. And the way you start to do things is to start with listening. So the point of listening is to learn, and the point of learning is so we can change what we do. You can't really call yourself a service user or a service user focused organization if the service user can't tell you that a thing you do is bad and you stop doing it. You can't call yourself trauma informed if you continually re-traumatize people through your service offer. So what this is about is listening to replace routine with thoughtfulness, create a kind of rich learning environment for everybody, because my core belief is public servants want to do good in the world. They're not in this, no one is deliberately doing bad things. And it's to try to understand what value looks like for a person rather than progress to a quantitative proxy target. Next slide, please. So this is about kind of having a culture of experimentation, to learn from listening and then do things. It's pointless listening if you're not going to do anything. And that experimentation should be a constant process because the world is constantly changing. Good ideas are not an artifact of hierarchy. So also about listening to your staff. Does the chief exec in your organization know if your cleaner has a brilliant idea because she spends hours in your waiting room? Encourage everyone to try things. What we've found in multiple projects is once you free staff from the shackles of hierarchy, they're really keen to try things, and it becomes really, really infectious, and really, really small things can make huge differences. And as managers and system leaders, you need to create this culture where it's easy to try things. In the statutory sector, we talk about being more like the voluntary sector, agile and nimble. And then we spend months and months and months trying to eliminate any risk from a prototype. Just move to a position where you're saying, is the thing legal and is it safe? And if it is, try it, but you must kind of gather the learning, feed that back into the system. And then you can embed what's worked well, but remember what good looks like is constantly changing because the world is constantly changing. We were all doing things before COVID that looked brilliant, and then overnight they became life-threateningly dangerous. Well, that's a really gross example of the small things that are happening in systems all the time. So this is about being really, really thoughtful as opposed to routine in our approaches to people. Routine and thresholded services cannot respond to the infinite variety of human beings. Next slide. So commit to these things. Commit to listening to your citizens actively, iteratively, and in multiple ways. Commit to acting on what they tell you and then listening again. Try to develop a shared sense of place with citizens, because remember, the people that use your service, they're citizens. They're not just service users. Critically examine all your service responses. Most of the services we have, if they were ever designed, were designed in the 1970s, and the world is very different. So try to take on a more curatorial role. Rather than kind of swaggering about like you own a place. Be really generous and open, invite people into your space to co-vision things with you. If you do that, they're much more likely to spend their money in your place. And let's face it, statutory services have got no money. Be compassionate and trauma informed, but really critically examine the way you're applying that, not just talking about it. And as I've said, kind of be experimental and provide a really permissive and supportive environment for staff. If you want to make thresholds fuzzy and permeable so they work for people, really the only way you can do that is to devolve discretion to the public facing worker.
So having heard from Gary and Alex, what we want to turn to now is what this might mean for you in your role as a commissioner. So if we start with the idea that we've already discussed in this session, that in complex contexts, it is systems rather than projects or organisations that create outcomes, what does this mean for us in our roles? So over the past few decades, funding and commissioning has been dominated by a focus on standardised support, one which ensures compliance and one which creates competition between organisations. But what this does is it hinders rather than enables the bespoke, flexible and joined up approaches that often make the most difference for people in communities. So in terms of what this might mean for your role as a commissioner, if you start to think of yourself as part of the system and as someone who has a shared responsibility for system change, you start to open up a whole different world of possibilities about how you might take forward your role. So when we start to think of commissioners in this way, we can start to see how your role might shift from ensuring compliance or acting as a contract manager to recognising that commissioners have an active role to play in contributing to and really nurturing healthy systems. And at the heart of this shift is developing, embedding and nurturing a culture which really focuses on collaboration, on listening and learning. And hopefully what came through really strongly when you heard Gary and Alex talk was the idea that collaboration, listening and learning were absolutely at the heart of everything that they were doing. That's the role that we want you to think about when you think about how you might take forward your approach as a commissioner. So what might this look like for you and how might you get started? Well, if we start with identifying the conditions for collaboration, rather than having a fixed procurement approach in mind, which is often where we begin as commissioners, thinking about how we might commission a service. Are we going to co-commission with another commissioner? Are we going to look at an alliance model? But actually, that often comes at the end of our process. So what we want you to do is to start to think about how you can bring back a focus on identifying the conditions for collaboration, rather than having a fixed procurement approach in mind. So the questions we've got on the screen here invite you to start with those conditions rather than a solution or a particular model which you might want to deliver, which you might want to work to. So how can you as a commissioner enable rather than control? And in doing that, in thinking through how you might enable rather than control, which people, which communities and which organisations are part of the systems which contribute to the outcomes that you care about and that you want to be a part of delivering? Once you've identified those people, how can you start to convene them? So how can you bring them together and how can you start to listen and learn about what matters most to them and about what needs to change to start to work towards and delivering those outcomes? Once you understand that, then you've got the question about how you as a commissioner can allocate, how you can distribute and how you can manage the resources which are available to you in a way which builds trust, which builds collaboration and which develops a shared understanding as a key asset across the system. So what might that look like in practice? We're all very used to seeing a traditional commissioning cycle, the plan, act, do, review cycle, the one which we often work through when we're going through procurement processes. But what we've got here is a reimagined commissioning cycle through a HLS lens. So if you reframe your approach to commissioning more broadly and start to think differently about your role, what you do is you open up the possibility to embed learning throughout, to create space for experimentation and adaptation, and to think about the wider role and influence you have on the system as a whole. So our starting point is to really understand the system, to bring together those people, those different organisations and those communities who have a say and an impact and who have a real interest in the outcomes that you want to be part of delivering. You can build trust and understanding with them, and what you gain from that is a collective knowledge which allows you to co-design something together. And in co-designing something, what you open up is the possibility for experimentation and exploration, one which is iterative, one which has learning at its heart, and which allows you to go back to not see something not going to plan as failure, but one which creates a learning opportunity to really kind of develop, iterate and learn and experiment together. And as part of that, you have a wider role in embedding and influencing this way of working. So we hope you found this session useful. We'd love to hear more about the work you're doing in your local area to rethink what it means to commission through a HLS lens. Please do get in touch. And if you've got any questions, or if there's anything you think we can offer you some additional support on, feel free to get in contact, and we'd love to have a conversation with you.